Imagine finding a Rosetta Stone to the cosmos, carved by hands thousands of years before the pyramids. At Göbekli Tepe, mysterious animal totems aren't just art. They might be an ancient sky map, revealing constellations lost to time and a sophistication that defies our textbooks. Join us as we attempt to decode humanity's oldest astronomical secret. If you love mysteries that make you question everything you thought you knew about human history, smash that like button and subscribe because this story is absolutely wild. In 1963, a group of researchers from the University of Chicago were surveying southeastern Turkey when they noticed something strange. There was a hill, an unusual hill that looked almost too perfectly shaped. The locals called it Potbelly Hill, or Göbekli Tepe in Turkish. The researchers took some notes and moved on, thinking it was just an old medieval cemetery, nothing special. They couldn't have been more wrong. For over 30 years, that hill sat there, hiding one of the most important archaeological discoveries in human history. It wasn't until 1994 that Klaus Schmidt decided to take a closer look. What he found would shake the foundations of everything we thought we knew about early human civilization. Klaus Schmidt was walking across that hill when he spotted something that made him stop in his tracks. There were limestone fragments scattered everywhere, but these weren't just random rocks. They were carved, intentionally shaped. And as he looked closer, he realized these stones were far too sophisticated to be from a medieval cemetery. Schmidt knew immediately that this was something special. He assembled a team and started digging. What they uncovered in those first few weeks was absolutely shocking. Beneath just a few feet of soil, they found massive T-shaped stone pillars arranged in circular patterns. These weren't small stones you could carry. Some of them weighed as much as 8 elephants, and they were covered in intricate carvings of animals, symbols, and mysterious figures. But here's where things get really crazy. When Schmidt's team dated the site, they couldn't believe the results. They tested again and again. The dates kept coming back the same. This site was built around 10,000 BCE, which means it's approximately 12,000 years old. To put that in perspective, let me give you some comparisons that will blow your mind. The Great Pyramid of Giza, one of the most famous ancient structures in the world, was built around 2500 BCE. That makes it about 4,500 years old. Göbekli Tepe is more than twice as old as the pyramids. Stonehenge, that mysterious circle of stones in England, was constructed around 3000 BCE. Göbekli Tepe predates Stonehenge by 7,000 years. Think about that for a second. When the ancient Egyptians were building their pyramids, Göbekli Tepe was already 7,500 years old. It was more ancient to them than we are to them. When people were raising the stones of Stonehenge, Göbekli Tepe had already been buried and forgotten for thousands of years. But the real mind-bender isn't just how old Göbekli Tepe is. It's who built it and what they were supposedly capable of at that time in history. According to everything we learned in history class, humans in 10,000 BCE were simple hunter-gatherers. They lived in small groups, moving from place to place, following herds of animals and gathering wild plants. They had stone tools, sure, but these were basic things like spear points and hand axes. The agriculture revolution, when humans learned to farm and grow crops, wasn't supposed to happen until around 8,000 BCE in the Fertile Crescent region. That's a full 2,000 years after Göbekli Tepe was built. Before farming, there were no permanent settlements, no cities, no complex societies. Or at least, that's what we thought. The invention of pottery, which allowed people to store food and water, didn't come around until about 7,000 BCE. The wheel, one of humanity's most important inventions, wasn't created until around 3,500 BCE in Mesopotamia. So let's be clear about what the timeline is telling us. The people who built Göbekli Tepe lived in a world without farms, without cities, without pottery to store things in, without wheels to move heavy objects, without metal tools to carve and shape stone, and without writing to record their knowledge or organize their work. Yet somehow they built something that seems impossible. When Klaus Schmidt first published his findings, many archaeologists were skeptical. Some thought he must have gotten the dates wrong. Others suggested that maybe this was built by a more advanced civilization that we just hadn't discovered yet. But as more evidence came in, and as other archaeologists visited the site and confirmed the findings, the reality became undeniable. Göbekli Tepe was real. It was as old as the dating suggested, and it was built by people we had completely underestimated. The discovery sent shockwaves through the archaeological community. Conferences were held, textbooks had to be rewritten, documentaries were made. Because Göbekli Tepe didn't just challenge one or two things we thought we knew about ancient humans, it challenged almost everything. Schmidt devoted the rest of his life to excavating and studying Göbekli Tepe. He called it a cathedral on a hill and said it was the most important archaeological site in the world. Sadly, Schmidt passed away in 2014, but his work continues today with other archaeologists carrying on his mission to understand this incredible place. And here's something that should make your jaw drop. After decades of excavation, archaeologists estimate they've only uncovered about 5% of the site. 5%. That means 95% of Göbekli Tepe is still buried underground, waiting to reveal even more secrets. Ground-penetrating radar and other scanning technologies have revealed that there are at least 20 circular stone structures buried at the site, possibly more. So far, only a handful have been excavated. Who knows what incredible discoveries are still waiting beneath the soil? The more we learn about Göbekli Tepe, the more questions we have, and one of the biggest questions is this: how did they do it? How did hunter-gatherers with nothing but stone tools and human muscle build something this massive and sophisticated? Before we get into that incredible engineering mystery, I want you to hit that like button if you're enjoying this mind-bending journey into ancient history. And make sure you're subscribed with notifications on, because we're going deep into mysteries that will change how you see human history. Seriously, the stuff we're about to discuss will challenge everything you learned in school. Trust me, you don't want to miss this. Now, let's really dig into what makes Göbekli Tepe so absolutely mind-blowing. To understand why this site is so revolutionary, we need to talk about what life was actually like in 10,000 BCE. Picture this. It's 12,000 years ago. The last ice age has recently ended. Glaciers that covered huge portions of North America, Europe, and Asia are melting. The climate is changing. New forests are growing. Animal herds are migrating to new areas. And humans, modern humans just like you and me, are living as hunters and gatherers. These people were smart, don't get me wrong. They had the same brain capacity we have today, but their lifestyle was very different from ours. A typical group might have 20 to 50 people, all related to each other through family ties. They would move seasonally, following animal herds and gathering wild grains, nuts, fruits, and vegetables. Their tools were made from stone, wood, and bone. A typical toolkit might include sharp stone blades for cutting meat, scrapers for preparing animal hides, stone points for spears and arrows, and hand axes for various tasks. These tools were effective for hunting and daily survival, but they were simple compared to what would come later. These groups lived in temporary shelters. They might construct simple huts from branches and animal skins, or they might take shelter in caves when available. The idea of a permanent settlement didn't make sense for their lifestyle. Why build something permanent when you need to move with the seasons and follow the food? Now, let's compare this to what we see at Göbekli Tepe. The site isn't just one or two stones placed together. It's a massive complex of multiple circular structures, each one carefully planned and constructed. The largest pillars at the site are T-shaped limestone blocks that stand about 18 feet tall and weigh up to 60 tons. To give you a sense of scale, that's about the same weight as 10 full-grown African elephants, or about 9 average cars all stacked together. But it's not just about size. These pillars are carved with incredible detail. There are reliefs of lions, foxes, wild boars, vultures, snakes, scorpions, and gazelles. There are abstract symbols that we still don't fully understand. Some pillars have human-like arms carved on their sides, with hands meeting at the front, as if the pillars themselves are meant to represent people or gods. The circular structures, which archaeologists call enclosures, are arranged with two larger pillars in the center and smaller pillars forming a circle around them. Stone benches run along the inside walls. Everything is precisely positioned and carefully constructed. Let me put this in perspective by comparing Göbekli Tepe to other ancient sites that we know about. The city of Jericho in the modern-day West Bank is often called one of the world's oldest cities. People started living there around 9000 BCE, building mud brick houses and eventually surrounding their settlement with stone walls. But that's 1,000 years after Göbekli Tepe was built, and Jericho's early constructions, while impressive, were nowhere near as sophisticated as Göbekli Tepe's massive carved pillars. Çatalhöyük, another famous ancient site in Turkey, is one of the best preserved Neolithic settlements in the world. People lived there from about 7,500 BCE to 5,700 BCE, building densely packed mud brick houses with elaborate wall paintings and bullhorn decorations. It gives us an amazing window into early settled life, but it came 2,500 years after Göbekli Tepe, and its people had the advantage of established farming and animal domestication. Let's jump forward even more. The Egyptian pyramids, built around 2500 BCE, are marvels of ancient engineering that still impress us today. But the Egyptians had copper and bronze tools for cutting stone. They had a complex, organized society with a pharaoh at the top, priests, scribes, engineers, and thousands of workers. They had farming that produced surplus food to feed all these workers. They had written language to keep records and organize the massive projects. They had thousands of years of accumulated knowledge to build upon. The people of Göbekli Tepe had none of that. Stonehenge, built in stages from about 3000 BCE to 2000 BCE, is another site that amazes people with its massive stones and mysterious purpose. The largest stones at Stonehenge, called sarsens, weigh about 25 tons. That's impressive, but remember, some pillars at Göbekli Tepe weigh 60 tons, and Stonehenge was built 7,000 years later by people who had farming, domesticated animals, pottery, and more advanced tools. Even comparing Göbekli Tepe to these later sites, which we consider more advanced, the engineering achievement is stunning. But comparing it to other sites from its own time period, there is no comparison. Nothing else from 10,000 BCE comes even close. During the same time period that Göbekli Tepe was being constructed, humans in other parts of the world were living in much simpler ways. In Europe, people were still living in small hunter-gatherer groups, using stone tools, following animal herds, and using stone tools. In North America, Paleo-Indians were hunting mammoths and other large game animals with clovis points, a type of stone spearhead. These weren't primitive or intelligent people. They were surviving and thriving in their environments using sophisticated knowledge of animal behavior, plant properties, seasons, and weather patterns. But they weren't building monumental stone structures. They weren't carving intricate art into multi-ton pillars. They weren't organizing hundreds or possibly thousands of people for massive construction projects. So what happened at Göbekli Tepe? Why was this site so different? That's the big question that archaeologists are scratching their heads. Some have suggested that maybe the people who built Göbekli Tepe weren't actually hunter-gatherers. Maybe they had already developed farming and we just haven't found the evidence yet. But extensive studies of the site and the surrounding area have found no evidence of domesticated plants or animals from this time period. No grinding stones for processing grain, no storage pits for keeping harvested crops, no signs of permanent housing where farming families would have lived. In fact, the evidence suggests the opposite. Animal bones found at the site are from wild species like gazelles and aurochs, wild cattle that wouldn't be domesticated for thousands of years. The tools found are typical hunter-gatherer tools, not farming implements. Other archaeologists have wondered maybe Göbekli Tepe was built over a very long time, with small groups of people adding just a little bit at a time over centuries. But the evidence doesn't support this either. The enclosures appear to have been constructed in relatively short time periods, with individual structures built according to unified plans. The conclusion, as impossible as it seems, is that mobile hunter-gatherers really did build Göbekli Tepe, and that forces us to completely rethink what hunter-gatherers were capable of. We have to imagine a society that, while not having permanent settlements or farming, was sophisticated enough to conceive of massive building projects. They had to have some way of organizing large groups of people. They had to have leaders or priests or someone who could plan these structures and direct the work. They had to have knowledge of engineering and mathematics to cut and position stones accurately. And perhaps most importantly, they had to have a reason to do all this work. They had to believe in something powerfully enough that they were willing to spend enormous amounts of time and energy on a construction project instead of just focusing on getting food for the next meal. This challenges the old model of human development that goes first hunting and gathering, then farming, then permanent settlements, then complex society, then monumental architecture. Göbekli Tepe shows us that humans built monumental architecture first, and maybe that motivated them to develop farming to support the people who worked on these projects. It's like the story of human progress got told backward, and Göbekli Tepe is the proof. Some researchers now think that places like Göbekli Tepe might have actually inspired the agricultural revolution. Maybe people gathered at these sites for religious ceremonies or festivals. Maybe these gatherings became so large and so regular that it made sense to start growing food nearby to feed everyone. Maybe the need to support these sacred centers pushed humans to invent farming, rather than farming leading to complex societies. If that's true, then Göbekli Tepe isn't just an impressive old building, it's the place where civilization began. It's the birthplace of the forces that would eventually lead to cities, writing, mathematics, and everything else that makes up modern society. And we only discovered it 30 years ago. Let's talk about the pillars themselves, because these things are absolutely incredible when you really think about what they represent. The pillars at Göbekli Tepe are T-shaped, meaning they look kind of like the letter T. The vertical part, called the shaft, rises up from the ground. The horizontal part at the top, called the crosspiece, extends out on both sides. The largest ones stand about 18 feet tall, which is roughly the height of a two-story house. But height is just one dimension. These aren't thin slabs of stone, they're thick, solid blocks of limestone. The largest examples have a volume of about 200 cubic feet and weigh approximately 60 tons. That's 120,000 pounds. To move something that heavy today, you'd need a massive crane and a reinforced flatbed truck. The ancient builders of Göbekli Tepe had neither of those things. There are dozens of these pillars at the site, arranged into circular or oval-shaped enclosures. Each enclosure has two large pillars in the center, standing parallel to each other, and then a circle of smaller pillars around the outside, set into a low stone wall. The smaller pillars are still massive by our standards, weighing several tons each. The enclosures themselves vary in size. The smallest discovered so far is about 30 feet across. The largest is 100 feet in diameter. That's bigger than most modern houses. And remember, this is just the floor space of one enclosure. The site has multiple enclosures spread across the hilltop. Now let's talk about why these pillars are so remarkable from an engineering standpoint. First, there's the question of why they're T-shaped. This isn't a natural shape for stone. It's not the easiest shape to carve, and it's definitely not the easiest shape to stand upright. A simple rectangular pillar would have been much easier to work with. So why did the builders choose this complicated T-shape? Many archaeologists believe the T-shape is symbolic. Some think the pillars represent stylized human figures, with the crosspiece being the head and shoulders and the shaft being the body. This interpretation is supported by the fact that many pillars have arms carved on their narrow sides, with hands meeting at the front just where a person's hands would be if they were standing with arms held across the body. If the pillars do represent people, or perhaps gods or ancestors, then this raises interesting questions about what was happening at Göbekli Tepe. Were the central pillars in each enclosure representing important deities? Were the surrounding pillars representing worshippers or community members? Was this a sacred gathering place where people came to be in the presence of their gods? We don't know for sure, but the T-shape clearly meant something important to the builders, and they were willing to go through enormous effort to create it. Second, let's consider the stone itself. Limestone is a sedimentary rock formed from the compressed remains of ancient sea creatures. It's relatively soft as rocks go, which is both good and bad for ancient builders. The softness means it can be carved with stone tools, which is good. But it also means the carvings can wear away over time, and the stone can crack if not handled carefully. The limestone at Göbekli Tepe came from quarries on the hillside, which we'll talk more about later. But once the stone was chosen, it had to be shaped into those distinctive T-shaped pillars, and this is where things get really interesting from an engineering perspective. To create a T-shaped pillar, the builders had to remove stone around the shape they wanted. Imagine you have a huge block of limestone and you want to create a T-shape from it. You have to cut away the stone on either side of the crosspiece, creating those two arms that extend out. You'd have to make sure the crosspiece was the right thickness and that it was perfectly level. You'd have to smooth the shaft so it was straight and true. All of this had to be done with stone tools. Copper tools wouldn't be invented for another 1,000 years. Bronze tools were still 3,000 years away. Iron tools were over 4,000 years in the future. So what did they use? Based on archaeological evidence from the site and from other contemporary locations, we can make educated guesses. The builders would have had stone hammers made from hard rocks like granite or basalt. These could be used to pound on the limestone, gradually breaking it away. They would have had stone chisels that could be struck with hammers to chip away at the rock more precisely. They might have also used a technique called fire setting, where you build a fire against the rock to heat it up, then quickly cool it with water. The rapid temperature change causes the rock to crack, making it easier to break away chunks. This technique has been used by stoneworkers for thousands of years in various parts of the world. Even with these techniques, shaping a 60-ton limestone block into a precise T-shape would have taken weeks or even months of constant work. Multiple people would have been working on each pillar at the same time, hammering away, chipping off flakes of stone bit by bit, slowly revealing the shape hidden inside the rock. And then there are the carvings. Oh, the carvings! This is where Göbekli Tepe really shows off. Many of the pillars are covered with detailed reliefs of animals and symbols. These aren't rough scratches or simple outlines. They're carefully executed three-dimensional carvings where the figures stand out from the background stone. The animals are depicted in profile, showing clear details of their bodies, heads, legs, and tails. There are predators like lions, foxes, and bears. There are prey animals like gazelles and wild cattle. There are birds, especially vultures, which appear repeatedly throughout the site. There are snakes, scorpions, spiders, and other creatures. Some pillars show multiple animals arranged in scenes, as if telling a story. Creating these reliefs would have required even more skill and patience than shaping the basic pillar form. The carver would have had to carefully chip away the background stone around each figure, making the animal stand out from the background stone. They'd have to get the proportions right, making sure the creature looked realistic and recognizable.
They'd have to add details like eyes, claws, feathers, and scales. This level of artistry suggests that the people of Göbekli Tepe had specialized craftspeople. Not everyone in their society would have had the skill to create these carvings. There must have been talented individuals who trained and practiced their craft, becoming expert stone carvers. This implies a level of social complexity we don't usually associate with hunter-gatherer societies. In most hunter-gatherer groups, everyone needs to contribute to finding food. There's not much room for specialization. But at Göbekli Tepe, it seems some people were able to focus on artistic and architectural work instead of hunting and gathering. This means the society must have been producing enough food to support these specialists, which is remarkable for a pre-agricultural people. The symbols carved on the pillars are particularly fascinating. There are repeated motifs that appear throughout the site: circles, crescents, H-shapes, and other geometric forms. Some archaeologists think these might be early writing, or at least proto-writing symbols representing concepts or ideas. Others think they might be astronomical symbols representing the sun, moon, stars, or constellations. One pillar, which has become known as the Vulture stone, has attracted special attention. It shows a vulture along with what might be a scorpion and various circular and geometric symbols. Some researchers have interpreted this as a kind of astronomical map or calendar, recording a specific celestial event. We'll talk more about this in the section on astronomical alignments.
All right, now we get to the really mind-bending part. How did they actually build this thing? We've established that the pillars are massive, sometimes weighing 60 tons. We've established that they were carved with incredible detail. And we've established that the people doing this work had no metal tools, no wheels, no draft animals like horses or oxen to help them, and no written language to help them plan and organize. So how did they do it? Let's break this down into steps and explore each challenge. Step 1. Quarrying the stone. The limestone for Göbekli Tepe's pillars came from quarries located right on the same hillside where the structures were built. Archaeologists have found these ancient quarries and studied them extensively to understand how the stone was extracted. When you look at these quarries today, you can see clear evidence of how the ancient builders worked. There are partially removed pillars still attached to the bedrock, frozen in time, showing us the exact techniques used. The builders would first identify a good section of limestone bedrock. They'd look for stone that was solid and free of major cracks or flaws. Then they would begin the painstaking process of separating a pillar-shaped block from the surrounding rock. The technique involved cutting a trench all the way around the shape they wanted. This trench might be a few feet deep and a foot or more wide. Workers would use stone hammers and possibly wooden or antler wedges to gradually chip away at the rock, making the trench deeper and deeper. Based on experimental archaeology, where modern researchers try to recreate ancient techniques, we can estimate how long this would take. A group of experienced workers using stone tools could probably remove about 3 to 6 cubic feet of stone per day. Remember, a large pillar might have a volume of 200 cubic feet, and you have to remove all the stone around it to free it from the bedrock. Let's do some math. If workers could remove, say, 5 cubic feet per day, and they needed to remove maybe 400 cubic feet of stone to free a large pillar, including all the trenching around it, that's 80 days of work. And that's just to separate it from the bedrock. They haven't even shaped it into a T yet or carved any decorations. If you had 20 people working on quarrying operations, you might be able to extract one large pillar every 2 to 3 months, working every day. Considering that Göbekli Tepe has dozens of large pillars plus many smaller ones, we're talking about years and years of quarrying work alone. And this assumes good conditions. If the stone turned out to have an unexpected crack, all that work might be wasted and they'd have to start over with a new block. If someone made a mistake and broke off a corner, they might have to abandon that pillar and begin again. The partially completed pillars still in the quarries give us poignant evidence of these difficulties. There's one pillar, which would have been the largest ever erected at the site, that's still attached to the bedrock. It's about 23 feet long and would have weighed over 50 tons if completed. But something went wrong. Maybe a crack appeared. Maybe the project was abandoned for some other reason. This giant pillar has been lying there, almost free of the bedrock, but not quite, for 12,000 years. Step 2. Shaping and carving the pillar. Once a block was freed from the bedrock, the real artistic work began. The rough block had to be shaped into that precise T-shape. The surfaces had to be smoothed, and then the intricate carvings of animals and symbols had to be added. Based on the evidence, it appears much of this work was done while the pillar was still in the quarry, before it was transported. This makes sense because stone is much easier to work when it's lying down than when it's standing up. The carvers could walk around it, sit on it, and access all its surfaces easily. The process of creating a relief carving goes like this. First, you outline the shape you want by pecking a groove into the stone all around it. Then, you carefully remove the background stone around that shape, making the figure stand out. You have to work gradually, removing thin layers at a time, constantly checking your progress to make sure you don't remove too much. For complex scenes with multiple animals, this process had to be repeated for each figure, all while making sure everything stayed in proper proportion and composition. A master carver working with helpers might spend months on a single pillar. And remember, they're doing this with stone tools. Every detail you see, every eye and claw and feather, was created by someone carefully tapping away with a stone hammer and chisel, flake by flake. The level of craftsmanship is honestly incredible. When you look at close-up photographs of the carvings, you can see that the artisans understood anatomy. The animals look realistic. They have proper proportions. The poses are natural. This wasn't the work of someone just randomly chipping at stone. These were skilled artists who had studied animals carefully and knew how to represent them in stone. Step 3. Transportation. Now comes perhaps the most mind-boggling challenge of all. How do you move a 60-ton stone from the quarry to the construction site? Today, we'd use a massive crane to lift it, place it on a reinforced truck, and drive it to where we wanted it. The people of Göbekli Tepe had none of those things. They didn't even have the wheel. The wheel wouldn't be invented for another 6,500 years, so they couldn't just build a cart and roll the stone where they wanted it. They didn't have domesticated animals to help pull. Cattle wouldn't be domesticated for another 1,000 years. Horses wouldn't be domesticated for thousands of years after that. All they had was human muscle power, wooden tools, and cleverness. So how did they do it? Archaeologists and experimental archaeologists have proposed several possible methods, and the answer is probably that they used a combination of techniques depending on the specific situation. Method 1. Sledges and rollers. A sledge is a simple platform with runners on the bottom, kind of like a sled. You can build one from wood. The pillar would be secured to the sledge, probably with ropes made from plant fibers or animal sinew. Then the sledge could be pulled across the ground. But pulling a 50-ton load across the ground, even on a sledge, would be nearly impossible. The friction would be enormous. This is where rollers come in. Rollers are logs or wooden cylinders placed under the sledge. As the sledge is pulled forward, it rolls over these logs, which greatly reduces friction. As the sledge moves past each roller, workers at the back pick up that roller and carry it to the front, creating a continuous rolling platform. This technique has been proven to work through modern experiments. A group of researchers in Germany managed to move a 40-ton stone using replica Stone Age tools, wooden sledges, and rollers. They found that it took about 500 people pulling together to move the stone. 500 people for a 40-ton stone. Remember, some of Göbekli Tepe's pillars are 50 tons. Now, to be fair, if you prepare the path well, laying down wooden trackways or even wetting the ground to reduce friction, you might be able to reduce the number of people needed. Some estimates suggest that with optimal conditions, you might get away with 200 to 300 people for the largest stones. But even that is an enormous number of people. And these aren't just 200 people standing around. These are 200 people all pulling in rhythm, coordinated, for hours or even days as the stone is slowly transported from the quarry to the construction site. This requires organization. Someone has to be in charge, directing the work. There probably need to be people calling out a rhythm so everyone pulls together. You need people managing the rollers, running back and forth to reposition them. You need people steering the sledge to keep it on course. You need people scouting ahead to clear obstacles and prepare the path. And you need to feed all these people. 200 workers pulling heavy stones all day will eat a lot of food. Someone has to be hunting and gathering enough food to feed the work crews. Someone has to be preparing that food. Someone has to be organizing the distribution of food and making sure everyone gets their share. This is way beyond what we typically imagine when we think of simple hunter-gatherer societies. Method 2. Levers and earthen ramps. Once the pillar arrived at the construction site, it had to be stood upright. This presents its own massive challenge. Based on evidence at the site, archaeologists believe the builders dug deep pits for the pillars to stand in. These pits were carefully shaped so the pillar would fit snugly and stand up straight. The pit for a large pillar might be 6 feet deep or more. The pillar, still lying on its sledge, would be positioned so its base was right at the edge of the pit. Then comes the really tricky part, tipping it up into a vertical position. One method that might have been used involves earthen ramps. Workers would build a large ramp of earth and stones sloping up from the pillar. Ropes attached to the top of the pillar would be pulled from the top of the ramp, gradually lifting the pillar toward vertical. As the pillar rises, workers at the base would use wooden levers to help guide it and keep it from sliding back. This method has been successfully demonstrated in experiments with smaller stones, but scaling it up to 50 tons pushes the limits of what seems possible with simple tools. Another possibility involves using a large wooden frame, kind of like a tripod, positioned over the pit. Ropes running through the top of this frame could provide a mechanical advantage, making it easier to lift the pillar. This is essentially a simple crane made from logs. Again, experiments have shown this can work for moderately sized stones, but we're still talking about forces and weights that are almost unimaginable without modern equipment. The base of the pillar would be carefully lowered into the pit. Workers would then fill in around the base with stones and packed earth to hold the pillar firmly in place. They'd use levels, probably simple water-filled troughs, to make sure the pillar was standing perfectly vertical. And then they'd do it all over again for the next pillar and the next and the next. Step 4. Constructing the enclosure walls. The pillars are impressive, but they're not the only architectural feature at Göbekli Tepe. Each enclosure has stone walls connecting the outer pillars and stone benches built against these walls. The walls are made of smaller stones, which is still a lot of work, but much more manageable than the massive pillars. These stones could be carried by 1 or 2 people. They were carefully fitted together, creating walls that have survived for 12,000 years. The benches are particularly interesting because they show attention to human comfort and perhaps ceremonial function. These weren't just random stones piled up. They were carefully constructed at a height suitable for people to sit on. This suggests that gatherings took place in these enclosures, with people sitting on the benches, surrounded by the towering pillars. Some enclosures also have terrazzo floors, a kind of early concrete made from crushed limestone mixed with water and clay. This creates a hard, smooth surface. Making terrazzo requires burning limestone to create lime, then mixing it with water and aggregate. This is sophisticated technology, showing that the builders understood chemistry, at least in a practical way. The entire process of building one enclosure, from quarrying the stones to erecting the pillars to constructing the walls and floor, would have taken years. Some estimates suggest 3 to 5 years of continuous work by a large crew for each major enclosure. And there are at least 20 enclosures at Göbekli Tepe.
Even if not all of them were built at the same time, we're still talking about an enormous investment of labor spanning decades or possibly centuries. Modern researchers have tried to calculate the total amount of labor involved in building Göbekli Tepe. These calculations involve a lot of assumptions and estimates, so they should be taken as rough approximations, but they give us a sense of scale. One estimate suggests that building the entire site might have required 500,000 person-hours of work. If you had 100 people working full-time, that's about 12 years of continuous work. If you had 50 people, it's 24 years. These numbers don't include all the people needed to support the workers by providing food, tools, and other necessities. Another way to think about it, if we assume that people could only work on construction projects part-time, maybe during certain seasons when food was plentiful and hunting was good, then the actual calendar time to build the site could stretch to many decades or even a century or more. This tells us something profound about the society that built Göbekli Tepe. They were capable of organizing large-scale, long-term projects. They could plan ahead, not just for the next meal or the next season, but for years into the future. They had social structures that allowed this kind of coordination. They had belief systems powerful enough to motivate this enormous effort. They were, in short, much more sophisticated than we give hunter-gatherers credit.
Now, let's really dive into the art of Göbekli Tepe, because this is where the site goes from impressive engineering feat to genuinely mysterious and thought-provoking. The pillars at Göbekli Tepe are covered with hundreds of carved figures. These carvings give us our best window into the minds of the people who built this place. What did they care about? What did they fear? What did they worship? Let's start with the animals. The most common animals depicted at Göbekli Tepe are ones that would have been familiar to people living in this region 12,000 years ago. But interestingly, they're not always the animals you'd expect. You might think that a hunting culture would primarily depict the animals they hunted for food, and there are some prey animals shown, like gazelles and aurochs, which are wild cattle. But actually, predators and dangerous animals show up much more frequently in the carvings. There are lots of big cats, probably lions or leopards. These are shown in dynamic poses, sometimes appearing to stalk or leap. Remember, 12,000 years ago, lions lived in this part of the world and would have been a real danger to humans. There are wild boars, which are aggressive animals that can be dangerous when confronted. There are bears. There are foxes, which, while not dangerous to humans, are clever predators that would have been respected for their cunning. And then there are the vultures. Vultures appear over and over at Göbekli Tepe, more than almost any other animal. These large scavenger birds, which feed on dead animals, seem to have held special significance for the builders. One of the most famous pillars, called the Vulture stone, shows a vulture prominently displayed along with other symbols. Why were vultures so important? We can make some educated guesses based on what we know about other ancient cultures and about human psychology. Vultures are associated with death because they feed on corpses. Many ancient cultures around the world have incorporated vultures into their death rituals and their mythology. In some cultures, vultures are seen as psychopomps, creatures that guide the souls of the dead to the afterlife. There's archaeological evidence that some early human cultures practiced excarnation, also called sky burial, where bodies of the dead were left exposed for vultures and other scavengers to consume. The bones would later be collected and buried or preserved. This practice has been found in various ancient cultures, from Tibet to Persia to parts of prehistoric Europe. Could the people of Göbekli Tepe have practiced something similar? Based on the prominence of vulture imagery, some archaeologists think it's possible. Perhaps Göbekli Tepe was associated with death rituals, a place where the community came to remember the dead and perhaps to expose bodies to the sky. There are also lots of snakes carved on the pillars. Snakes appear coiled, in striking poses, and sometimes in groups. Like vultures, snakes seem to have been symbolically important, rather than just being random animals from the environment. Snakes have been symbols in human cultures for thousands of years, often associated with danger, transformation, the underworld, or hidden knowledge.
The fact that they appear so frequently at Göbekli Tepe suggests they carried special meaning for its builders. Scorpions also show up repeatedly. These creatures are dangerous, capable of delivering painful or even deadly stings. Their inclusion in the carvings might be a way of acknowledging the dangers of the natural world, or they might have had symbolic meanings we can only guess at. Birds other than vultures are also shown, including waterfowl like ducks or geese and what might be cranes. These could represent different aspects of the natural world or different symbolic concepts. What's particularly interesting is what's not commonly shown. Humans are rarely depicted at Göbekli Tepe. There are a few possible human figures, but they're abstract and not as detailed as the animal carvings. This is unusual. Many ancient cultures loved to depict themselves in their activities, but at Göbekli Tepe, the focus is overwhelmingly on animals. This could mean that the site was focused on humans' relationship with the animal world, perhaps reflecting hunting magic, animistic beliefs where animals have spirits or souls, or totemism where different groups identify with different animals. Now let's talk about the abstract symbols. Scattered among the animal carvings are various geometric and abstract symbols that appear repeatedly. These include circles and discs of various sizes, sometimes standing alone, sometimes in groups or patterns. Some archaeologists think these might represent the sun or moon, or perhaps celestial bodies like stars or planets. Others think they might be more abstract concepts. Crescents, which could represent the moon in its crescent phase. If so, this would suggest the people of Göbekli Tepe were paying attention to the moon's cycles, which makes sense for any society that needed to track time and seasons. H-shapes, which appear on several pillars. The meaning of these is unclear. Some researchers think they might be schematic representations of human figures. Others think they might be architectural symbols, representing the T-shaped pillars themselves. Belt-like bands and what might be loincloths carved on some pillars, particularly those thought to represent anthropomorphic figures. If the T-shaped pillars do represent stylized humans or gods, these belts and clothing would support that interpretation. Cup marks, which are small circular depressions carved into the stone. These appear on some pillars and on some of the stone blocks used in walls and benches. Cup marks are found at prehistoric sites all over the world, and their meaning is debated. They might have been used for small offerings, or they might be astronomical markers, or they might have been purely decorative. One fascinating symbol that appears on several pillars is what some researchers call a handbag or bucket shape. It looks a bit like a rectangular bag with a handle on top. This exact same symbol appears in much later ancient cultures, including Sumerian carvings from thousands of years later. What does it mean? Nobody knows for sure. Some think it might represent a container for sacred objects. Others think it might be an astronomical symbol. The fact that it shows up across different cultures and time periods is intriguing and mysterious. Now here's where things get really interesting. Some researchers have started to analyze these symbols not just individually, but as a system. If you map out where different symbols appear and how often they appear together, patterns start to emerge. Certain symbols seem to be associated with certain animals. Certain combinations appear more frequently than random chance would suggest. This has led some archaeologists to propose that these symbols might represent an early form of proto-writing, or at least a sophisticated symbolic system for recording ideas. Not writing in the full sense of representing spoken language, but perhaps a way of recording concepts, stories, or information. If this is true, then Göbekli Tepe might preserve some of humanity's earliest attempts at creating a symbolic language, predating the invention of actual writing by 7,000 years. Other researchers are more cautious about this interpretation. They point out that lots of prehistoric art uses repeated symbols without being writing. The symbols might be decorative, religious, or meaningful in ways that don't constitute writing. This debate is ongoing, and as more of Göbekli Tepe is excavated and analyzed, we may get clearer answers.
Let's talk about the artistic skill on display. When you look closely at the best preserved carvings at Göbekli Tepe, the level of artistry is remarkable. The animals are rendered with understanding of anatomy and proportion. The lions have muscular bodies, detailed faces, and realistic poses. The vultures have carefully carved feathers. The snakes have scaled skin texture. The artists understood how to create depth and three-dimensionality through relief carving. Figures in the foreground stand out more than background elements. Overlapping is used to show that one figure is in front of another. There's also composition and design sense. The way multiple animals are arranged on a pillar shows thought about visual balance and flow. The placement of symbols around and between the animals shows planning and aesthetic consideration. This wasn't crude cave painting by firelight, the kind of primitive art we might condescendingly imagine from early humans. This was sophisticated representational art created by skilled craftspeople who had trained in their art form, possibly for years. And these artists were working in one of the most difficult mediums possible, stone. Unlike clay, which can be added to and reshaped, or paint, which can be covered over, stone carving is subtractive and permanent. Every strike of the hammer removes stone that can never be replaced. Mistakes can't be easily fixed. Creating detailed, realistic animal figures under these conditions requires not just skill, but confidence. The artists had to visualize what they wanted to create and execute it without significant errors. This level of artistic achievement suggests that the society at Göbekli Tepe valued art highly enough to support specialists who could develop these skills. Some people were freed from the daily requirements of food gathering to focus on creating these magnificent carvings. There's one more aspect of the carvings that deserves mention: their preservation. These carvings are 12,000 years old. Think about that. They were made closer in time to the extinction of woolly mammoths than to the construction of the Egyptian pyramids. They were made when the Sahara was green and lush, when much of North America was still covered in ice sheets from the last glaciation. Yet we can still see them clearly. We can identify the species of animals depicted. We can trace the lines of the symbols. The stone has held these images for 12 centuries. This is partly because limestone, while soft enough to carve, is also durable if protected from weathering. But it's also because Göbekli Tepe was deliberately buried. Now we come to one of the most mysterious and controversial aspects of Göbekli Tepe: the possibility that it functioned as an ancient observatory and that some of its carvings might record astronomical events. Let's start with the famous Vulture stone, also known as Pillar 43 from Enclosure D. This pillar is one of the most heavily decorated stones at the site. At the top of the stone is a row of what some researchers call handbag or bucket shapes. Below that are numerous animal carvings arranged across the surface of the stone. The most prominent figure is a large vulture with spread wings. Near it is a scorpion, clearly identifiable with its curved tail and pincers. There's also what appears to be an ibex or wild goat. Various birds are shown in different poses. And at the bottom of the stone is one of the few human figures found at Göbekli Tepe: a headless man with an erect phallus. For years, archaeologists puzzled over what this arrangement might mean. Was it telling a story? Was it symbolic of death and rebirth? Was it shamanic imagery related to trance experiences or religious rituals? Then, in 2017, two engineers from the University of Edinburgh, Martin Sweatman and Dimitrios Tsikritsis, published a paper that proposed a radical new interpretation. They suggested that the animals on the vulture stone actually represent constellations, and that the pillar serves as a kind of date stamp recording a specific astronomical configuration. According to their interpretation, the vulture represents what we now call the constellation Sagittarius. The scorpion obviously corresponds to Scorpius. Other animals on the stone could map to other constellations visible in the sky. The researchers used computer software called Stellarium, which can recreate the night sky as it appeared from any location on Earth at any time in history. They tried to find dates when the constellations would have been arranged as shown on the vulture stone. Their analysis pointed to several possible dates, but one stood out: approximately 10,950 BCE, plus or minus 250 years. This date is significant for a specific reason. Based on evidence from ice cores taken in Greenland and other geological data, some scientists have theorized that Earth experienced a major catastrophic event around 10,890 BCE. Based on this scholarly theory, this event could have been triggered by a comet or multiple comet fragments striking Earth. According to this interpretation, such an impact would have triggered a period of rapid climate cooling known as the Younger Dryas, which lasted for about 1,000 years. The Younger Dryas period saw temperatures drop dramatically, especially in the northern hemisphere. Glaciers that had been retreating began advancing again. Many large animal species went extinct during this time, including mammoths, mastodons, and saber-toothed cats in North America. It was a catastrophic period for life on Earth. Sweatman and Secret-Cease proposed that the people of Göbekli Tepe witnessed this comet impact or its effects, and that the Vulture stone is their way of recording the event. According to this interpretation, the headless human figure could symbolize the death and destruction caused by the impact. If this interpretation is correct, it would mean that Göbekli Tepe preserves humanity's oldest astronomical records. It would suggest that the people who built this site had sophisticated knowledge of the stars and could track celestial events. It would mean they had a form of proto-writing, using animal symbols to represent constellations and record information for future generations. This theory has generated significant interest in popular media and among researchers interested in catastrophism and ancient astronomy. The idea that hunter-gatherers could have been tracking comets and recording astronomical data 12,000 years ago is absolutely remarkable. However, and this is important, many archaeologists who actually work at Göbekli Tepe are skeptical of this interpretation. Jens Natroff, an archaeologist who worked on the excavation team, has pointed out several problems with the comet theory. He notes that the paper by Sweatman and Secret-Cease seems to cherry-pick certain symbols while ignoring others that don't fit their interpretation. For example, the headless man on the Vulture stone has a prominently displayed erect phallus. This is clearly an important part of the carving, but it doesn't fit well with an interpretation about death and destruction. In many ancient cultures, erect phalluses symbolize fertility, life force, and regeneration, not death. Natroff and other archaeologists suggest that the vultures more likely relate to beliefs about death and the afterlife that were common in early Neolithic cultures. The vultures could symbolize the process of excarnation, where bodies were exposed for vultures to consume. The headless human could represent the soul departing the body. The overall scene might depict the journey of the dead to the afterlife. This interpretation fits better with what we know about early Neolithic burial practices and beliefs. We have evidence from other sites in the region showing that vultures played an important role in death rituals. So, which interpretation is correct? Honestly, we don't know for sure. Based on current evidence, we can say that some researchers think the Vulture stone records a comet impact around 10,950 BCE, while others think it's more likely related to death rituals and beliefs about the afterlife. Both interpretations are scholarly, both have evidence supporting them, but the archaeological community working at the site tends to favor the death ritual interpretation. What's not in dispute is that the people of Göbekli Tepe were paying attention to the sky. Whether they were tracking comets or using the stars for ritual purposes, or both, they clearly had knowledge of astronomy.
There's other evidence for astronomical awareness at the site. The enclosures appear to have specific orientations. Some researchers have suggested that certain structures aligned with the rising or setting of particular stars or constellations at specific times of year. The circular design of the enclosures, with 2 central pillars and a ring of outer pillars, could itself be a model of the cosmos. The 2 central pillars might represent celestial poles or important stars, with the outer pillars representing the horizon or the celestial circle. The fact that ground-penetrating radar reveals the three main enclosures are arranged in a nearly perfect equilateral triangle suggests sophisticated planning and possibly astronomical significance. An equilateral triangle is a meaningful geometric shape that appears in many ancient cosmological models. The elevated location of Göbekli Tepe itself is significant. The site sits at one of the highest points in the region, with clear views of the horizon in almost all directions. This would make it an excellent location for observing celestial phenomena. For a hunter-gatherer society, having knowledge of the stars would be practically useful. The stars could help with navigation, with tracking seasons, with knowing when animals would migrate or when plants would fruit. Many hunter-gatherer cultures around the world have sophisticated astronomical knowledge passed down through oral tradition. But the level of effort put into Göbekli Tepe suggests this wasn't just practical knowledge. The massive stone pillars, the intricate carvings, the deliberate architectural planning all point to something more profound. This was a sacred space where the earthly and the celestial met. Perhaps people gathered here during specific astronomical events. Maybe they came to observe meteor showers, which would have been spectacular and possibly frightening to ancient people. The torrid meteor stream, which is still visible today every October and November, was likely much more intense 12,000 years ago. This meteor stream, based on the comet theory, could have been associated with the comet fragments that allegedly struck Earth during the Younger Dryas. Whether or not the comet impact happened, whether or not the Vulture stone records it, the presence of meteor-watching traditions at Göbekli Tepe is plausible. Seeing bright streaks of fire shooting across the night sky would certainly inspire awe and maybe terror in ancient observers. Building a sacred site to observe and perhaps propitiate these celestial phenomena would make sense. The symbolism throughout Göbekli Tepe suggests a worldview where the boundaries between earth and sky, between human and animal, between life and death, were permeable and interconnected. This is consistent with animistic belief systems found in many hunter-gatherer cultures. In such a worldview, the movement of stars and planets isn't just physical phenomena. These are living entities with their own agency and power. Understanding them, respecting them, perhaps trying to influence them through ritual would all be important activities. So, while we may never know with absolute certainty whether the Vulture stone depicts a comet impact, we can be confident that the builders of Göbekli Tepe looked up at the night sky with wonder, that they tried to understand what they saw, and that they incorporated that celestial knowledge into their monument and their rituals. And that's remarkable. These people, living 11,500 to 12,000 years ago, without writing, without cities, without metal tools, were grappling with the same big questions that still occupy us today. Where did we come from? What happens when we die? What is our place in the cosmos? Göbekli Tepe is their answer, or at least part of their answer, and it's still standing, still speaking to us across the millennia, even if we're not always sure exactly what it's trying to say. Let's take a step back from the mysteries and symbolism and ask a very practical question. How did the society that built Göbekli Tepe actually function? We've talked about the massive stones, the intricate carvings, the architectural sophistication, but none of that happens by magic. It requires people, lots of people, organized people, people who can work together toward a common goal over long periods of time. Traditional models of hunter-gatherer societies don't really account for this kind of organization. The standard picture is of small, egalitarian groups of 20 to 50 people, making decisions by consensus with little hierarchy beyond age and gender-based roles. But Göbekli Tepe challenges this picture. To understand just how much labor was involved, archaeologists have tried to calculate the person-hours required for various tasks. Let's start with quarrying and transporting a single large pillar. Based on experimental archaeology and historical accounts of megalith moving from other cultures, researchers estimate the following. Quarrying a large pillar from the bedrock might take a team of 20 workers about 3 months working every day. That's approximately 15,000 person-hours for one pillar. Carving and decorating that pillar might take a team of skilled artists and their assistants another 2 to 3 months. That's another 10,000 to 15,000 person-hours. Transporting the finished pillar from the quarry to the construction site, even though the distance is relatively short, might require 200 to 500 people working together for a week. That's another 35,000 to 90,000 person-hours. Erecting the pillar and installing it in its socket might take 100 people several days. That's another 10,000 person-hours. So for a single large pillar, we're looking at somewhere between 70,000 and 130,000 person-hours of work. Göbekli Tepe has dozens of large pillars and many more smaller ones. If we conservatively estimate that the site required work on 50 major pillars, plus the walls, floors, and other architectural features, we might be looking at 5 to 10 million person-hours of labor. Now, these workers weren't doing this full-time year-round. They still had to hunt and gather food for themselves and their families. Based on studies of modern hunter-gatherer societies in the region where Göbekli Tepe is located, people might spend about 3 to 6 hours a day on food acquisition and food processing activities. That leaves some time for other work, but not unlimited amounts. Let's say people could contribute maybe 20 hours per week to construction projects during certain seasons when food was plentiful. That's about 1,000 hours per person per year. If the site took 100 years to build, which is a reasonable estimate based on radiocarbon dating and the number of structures, then you'd need an average of 50,000 to 100,000 person-years of labor. Spread across 100 years, that's 500 to 1,000 people contributing labor each year. But they wouldn't all be there at the same time. Construction probably happened in intensive bursts during certain seasons. During these periods, you might have several hundred to possibly over 1,000 people gathered at the site. Now, here's the really mind-bending part. None of these people lived at Göbekli Tepe permanently. Extensive excavations have found no evidence of permanent housing at the site. No hearths for cooking daily meals, no trash pits where you dump broken pottery and food scraps from everyday life, no storage facilities for grain or other foods. This suggests that Göbekli Tepe wasn't a city or even a village. It was a destination. People came here for specific purposes, probably during specific times of the year, and then they left again. Where did they come from? Archaeological surveys of the surrounding region have found numerous small sites that could have been seasonal camps used by hunter-gatherer groups. These sites have evidence of hunting and food processing, but no monumental architecture. Based on the distribution of these sites, researchers estimate that people might have traveled to Göbekli Tepe from distances of up to 150 kilometers, which is about 93 miles. That's several days of walking. So we have to imagine seasonal gatherings where hundreds or possibly over 1,000 people from different groups across a wide region would converge on this hilltop. They'd work together on construction projects, they'd participate in rituals and ceremonies, and then they'd disperse back to their home territories. This pattern is actually known from other cultures. In many parts of the world, hunter-gatherer groups that normally live in small, scattered bands come together for large seasonal gatherings. These might be held at prime fishing locations during salmon runs, or at traditional meeting places where multiple groups gather to trade, arrange marriages, perform ceremonies, and share information. What's unique about Göbekli Tepe is the permanent monumental architecture. Most hunter-gatherer gathering sites don't have stone temples, but the social pattern of seasonal aggregation is well documented. Now let's think about the logistics. If you have several hundred to possibly over 1,000 people gathering at a site, how do you feed them? Modern hunter-gatherer societies in the region where Göbekli Tepe is located traditionally relied on several food sources. There were wild cereals like wheat and barley that could be harvested in late spring and early summer.
There were nuts and fruits in autumn, and there was hunting year-round, though certain seasons were better for different animals. Animal bones found at Göbekli Tepe suggest large-scale gazelle hunting. Gazelles are migratory animals that travel in herds. At certain times of year, these herds would pass through the region in large numbers. Hunter-gatherers could organize cooperative hunts to kill many animals at once, far more than a small family group could consume. This surplus meat could be dried or smoked to preserve it, and some of it could be used to feed work crews at Göbekli Tepe. The feasting remains found at the site suggest that communal meals were an important part of activities there. But someone had to organize all this. Someone had to decide when to hold the gatherings. Someone had to plan the hunting expeditions. Someone had to coordinate the construction work, making sure the right stones were quarried and transported at the right time, making sure skilled carvers were available, making sure the pillars were erected safely.
This implies some form of social hierarchy, or at least specialization of roles. There were probably individuals or groups who had more influence than others, who could call people together and direct activities. Klaus Schmidt, the archaeologist who led the excavations, suggested that Göbekli Tepe might have been built and controlled by a priestly class or religious specialists. These individuals might not have had political power in the sense of controlling territory or commanding warriors, but they had ritual authority. They were the ones who knew how to perform the ceremonies. They were the custodians of sacred knowledge, and people would come from far away to participate in rituals under their direction. This is one of the earliest known examples of specialized religious authority in human history. If Schmidt's interpretation is correct, then Göbekli Tepe shows us the origin of organized religion, with priests or shamans who have special status based on their ritual knowledge rather than their political power. Other researchers are more cautious about invoking a priestly class. They point out that many hunter-gatherer societies manage large gatherings through consensus and traditional practices rather than through formal hierarchy. Maybe the construction of Göbekli Tepe was organized collectively, with different groups taking turns hosting the gatherings and contributing labor. We can't know for certain which model is correct. Maybe the truth is somewhere in between. Maybe there were respected ritual specialists who had influence but not absolute authority. Maybe there were traditional systems of reciprocity, where groups took turns contributing labor and hosting gatherings. What's clear is that the people who built Göbekli Tepe had sophisticated social organization. They could plan long-term projects. They could coordinate the labor of hundreds of people. They could bring together groups from across a wide region. They could feed large gatherings. They could pass down building techniques and artistic styles over generations. All of this requires communication, cooperation, and shared goals. It requires trust between groups that might normally be competitors for hunting territories and resources. It requires belief in something bigger than any individual group's immediate needs. And that something bigger, whatever it was powerful enough to motivate people to spend enormous amounts of time and energy building a stone temple on a hilltop. This changes our understanding of hunter-gatherer capabilities. For a long time, anthropologists thought that this kind of complex social organization only emerged after the agricultural revolution, when settled communities and food surpluses made it possible to have specialists and hierarchies. Göbekli Tepe shows us that humans were capable of complexity much earlier. We didn't need farming to organize ourselves for big projects. We didn't need cities to have shared cultural practices that spanned wide regions. We didn't need writing to pass down knowledge and maintain traditions over generations. What we needed was motivation, and apparently religious or ritual motivation was powerful enough to inspire feats of engineering that still impress us today. Before we continue, if you're finding this fascinating, let me know in the comments what aspect of Göbekli Tepe interests you most. Is it the engineering, the symbolism, the social organization? I love hearing what viewers think. And don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss the rest of this journey through ancient mysteries. Now we need to talk about how Göbekli Tepe completely upends traditional narratives about the development of human civilization. For most of the 20th century, archaeologists and historians worked with a specific model of how civilizations developed. This model, sometimes called the Neolithic Revolution theory, goes something like this. First, humans lived as nomadic hunter-gatherers for hundreds of thousands of years. Then, around 10,000 BCE, people in the Fertile Crescent of the Middle East figured out how to domesticate plants and animals. This led to farming, which led to settled villages, which led to food surpluses, which led to population growth, which led to division of labor and social hierarchy, which led to cities, which led to writing and advanced technology. It's a neat linear progression. Hunting and gathering leads to farming, leads to villages, leads to cities, leads to civilization. The problem is, Göbekli Tepe doesn't fit this model at all. Göbekli Tepe was built around 9500 BCE to 8000 BCE. Agriculture in this region didn't become established until around 8000 BCE at the earliest, so Göbekli Tepe predates farming by at least 1500 years, possibly longer. The people who built it were hunter-gatherers. We know this because animal bones at the site are all from wild species. There are no sheep or goat bones showing signs of domestication. The plant remains are wild cereals, not domesticated wheat or barley. Yet these hunter-gatherers built something that the old model says should be impossible without agriculture. They built monumental architecture. They carved sophisticated art. They developed complex symbolic systems. They organized large-scale cooperative labor. How do we explain this? One possibility, which Klaus Schmidt and others have suggested, is that we've had the cause and effect backward. Maybe religion came before farming, not after it. Here's how this might have worked. For reasons we can only speculate about, maybe related to climate change at the end of the Ice Age, or maybe from cultural developments we don't fully understand, people in this region developed new religious ideas or ritual practices. These practices required large gatherings at sacred sites like Göbekli Tepe. As more and more people started coming to these gatherings, the logistics became challenging. How do you feed hundreds of people during these events? Wild food sources, while abundant in this region, still had to be gathered and processed. Someone, maybe many people working over time, figured out that certain wild plants could be encouraged to grow more abundantly. Wild wheat and barley growing near the gathering sites could be protected, watered, and their seeds collected and replanted. Wild animals could be captured young and raised near human settlements. Over time, this active management of food resources led to true domestication. Plants were selected for traits that made them easier to harvest, animals were bred for docility and productivity, and gradually farming emerged as a way to support the religious centers and the people who worked at them. In this model, Göbekli Tepe and sites like it didn't result from farming, they caused it. The need to support ritual activity motivated the development of agriculture.
This is a radical idea, but there's evidence to support it. Some of the earliest domesticated wheat varieties have been found at a site just 20 miles from Göbekli Tepe, dating to about 10,500 years ago, just a few centuries after Göbekli Tepe was built. This suggests that agriculture developed in this specific region, possibly in response to needs created by sites like Göbekli Tepe. Another piece of evidence: once agriculture became established, the monumental structures at Göbekli Tepe were abandoned. The site was deliberately buried around 8000 BCE, right when farming communities were becoming more common in the region. Maybe once farming villages could support local ritual activities, the big regional center at Göbekli Tepe was no longer necessary. This interpretation turns the traditional narrative upside down. Instead of material conditions, economic changes, leading to cultural and religious developments, it suggests that cultural and religious changes drove economic innovations. People didn't build temples because they had surplus food from farming. They developed farming because they needed to support their temples. Whether or not this specific interpretation is correct, Göbekli Tepe definitely challenges the idea that cultural sophistication requires agricultural civilization. These hunter-gatherers were not simple, primitive people just trying to survive day to day. They were capable of abstract thought, symbolic expression, long-term planning, and collective action on a massive scale. This has implications for how we think about human cognitive evolution. For a long time, some researchers believed that major advances in human thinking happened only recently in our history, maybe in the last 20,000 or 30,000 years. They pointed to evidence like cave art, musical instruments, and elaborate burial practices appearing in the archaeological record around this time. But Göbekli Tepe suggests that humans had sophisticated cognitive abilities much earlier than the evidence might suggest. The lack of earlier monumental architecture doesn't mean people weren't capable of building it. Maybe they just didn't have a reason to, or maybe they built in materials that didn't preserve, or maybe we just haven't found their sites yet. Human brains had reached their modern size and structure by at least 200,000 years ago, possibly longer. Anatomically modern humans have existed for at least that long, but for most of that time, the archaeological record doesn't show the kind of complex cultural behavior we see at sites like Göbekli Tepe. There are two possible explanations. Either humans had the biological capacity for complex culture but didn't express it for some reason, or the evidence of early complex culture hasn't been preserved or found. Göbekli Tepe supports the second explanation. If hunter-gatherers 12,000 years ago could build this, maybe similar groups 20,000 or 50,000 or 100,000 years ago could have done impressive things too. Maybe they built in wood, which rotted away. Maybe they created art on surfaces that eroded. Maybe their sites are underwater now, submerged by rising sea levels at the end of the Ice Age. The point is, Göbekli Tepe warns us against underestimating ancient people based solely on the material evidence we happen to have found. Absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. Göbekli Tepe also challenges assumptions about the relationship between technology and culture. We tend to think that advanced technology enables advanced culture. You need metal tools to create intricate art, right? You need writing to organize complex projects, right? Wrong. The people of Göbekli Tepe managed to create intricate art with stone tools. They organized complex projects without writing. They built sophisticated architecture without metal or wheels or pulleys or any of the technologies we think of as essential. This shows that human ingenuity isn't limited by technology. When people are motivated, when they have knowledge and skill, they can accomplish remarkable things with surprisingly simple tools. The limiting factors aren't physical tools, they're imagination, knowledge, organization, and motivation. Another traditional assumption challenged by Göbekli Tepe is the idea that early human societies were egalitarian, without significant social hierarchy or inequality. Some anthropologists have argued that hunter-gatherers lived in relatively equal societies where resources were shared and no one had much more power than anyone else. But Göbekli Tepe suggests there were specialists and possibly leaders with authority to organize massive construction projects. This doesn't necessarily mean a rigid class system like in later civilizations, but it does suggest some form of social differentiation based on skill, knowledge, or ritual authority. We also have to reconsider assumptions about warfare and conflict. Many researchers have suggested that warfare became common only after agriculture and settled villages created competition over land and stored resources. Hunter-gatherers, the argument goes, were generally peaceful because they were mobile and had no accumulated wealth worth fighting over. But if hunter-gatherer groups could organize to build Göbekli Tepe, they could potentially organize for warfare too. The capacity for collective action can be used for building or for fighting. While there's no direct evidence of warfare at Göbekli Tepe itself, the ability to coordinate hundreds of people suggests the social structures that could enable organized violence existed. This doesn't mean we should assume ancient hunter-gatherers were violent, but it does mean we shouldn't assume they were incapable of violence either. Humans are complex, and our ancestors were just as human as we are.
Perhaps the most profound way Göbekli Tepe challenges our understanding is in what it suggests about the human drive to create meaning. These people invested enormous resources into building something that had no obvious practical function. The enclosures weren't houses, they weren't fortifications, they weren't storage facilities. They were places where people came together to experience something sacred, to connect with forces larger than themselves, to express ideas and symbols in stone and symbol. The effort they put into this suggests that meaning-making, spiritual expression, and connection to the transcendent were as important to them as food and shelter. This is deeply human. Across all cultures and all times, humans create sacred spaces, tell stories about where we came from and where we're going, seek connection with the divine or the numinous. Göbekli Tepe shows that this impulse isn't a luxury that emerges only after material needs are met. It's fundamental to who we are as a species. Maybe the real message of Göbekli Tepe is that our ancestors weren't that different from us. They looked up at the stars and wondered. They grieved their dead and hoped for an afterlife. They came together in community to celebrate and worship. They created beauty because beauty matters. They built monuments to outlast their own lives because they wanted to leave something behind. Understanding this, we can see Göbekli Tepe not as some inexplicable anomaly, but as evidence of the human spirit expressing itself in stone. Our ancestors were fully human, with the same capacity for imagination, creativity, cooperation, and transcendence that we have today. They just happened to live in a time before writing, before cities, before metal. But that didn't stop them from creating something that still moves us 12,000 years later.
Now we come to one of the most perplexing aspects of Göbekli Tepe, its ending. After being used for approximately 1,500 years, Göbekli Tepe was abandoned. But it wasn't just abandoned in the sense of people stopping to visit it. It was deliberately and carefully buried. The enclosures were filled in with dirt and stone rubble. Thousands of tons of material were brought in and used to cover the pillars and walls. The site was transformed from a hilltop temple complex into what looked like a natural hill. This burial was done with care. The pillars weren't smashed or defaced. The carvings weren't destroyed. Everything was carefully covered and preserved. It's as if the people wanted to protect the site, to keep it safe by hiding it underground. Why would they do this? Let's be clear, this is one of the biggest unsolved mysteries of Göbekli Tepe. Archaeologists have proposed several theories, but we don't have definitive answers. One possibility is that the site had become sacred or taboo in a new way. Maybe the religious beliefs of the people changed, and the old enclosures represented an earlier form of spirituality that was no longer practiced. Rather than destroy the sacred structures or let them fall into ruin, people chose to bury them, showing respect while also sealing them away. This pattern of ritually closing or terminating sacred structures appears in many cultures. When a temple or shrine has served its purpose, or when new beliefs replace old ones, the old sacred space might be respectfully decommissioned rather than simply abandoned or destroyed. Another theory is that the burial was practical. If the site was no longer being actively used and maintained, the large pillars standing exposed to the elements might have been seen as dangerous. They could topple over in earthquakes or severe weather. By burying them, people ensured they would remain stable and protected. A third possibility involves the changing economy and society of the region. Around 8000 BCE, right when Göbekli Tepe was being buried, farming was becoming established. Permanent villages were appearing. The social pattern of seasonal gatherings at regional centers might have been giving way to more localized community practices. As farming communities developed their own local ritual sites and practices, the great regional center at Göbekli Tepe might have lost its purpose. Each village could have its own small shrine. There was no longer a need for everyone to travel long distances to a single sacred mountain. But rather than let this important ancient site fall into neglect, a deliberate decision was made to preserve it by burial. This suggests that even as people's lifestyles were changing, they still felt a deep connection to and respect for the place their ancestors had built.
Some researchers have suggested the burial might be connected to the climate changes happening at this time. The Younger Dryas cold period was ending and temperatures were rising. The environment was changing. Maybe the burial of Göbekli Tepe was seen as necessary to conclude one era and begin another, a ritual marking of transition. There's also a more dramatic theory, though it's speculative. Some researchers wonder if the burial was defensive, meant to protect the site from some threat. Could there have been conflict between different groups? Could raiders or invaders have been threatening the region? Might people have buried their sacred site to hide it from enemies? This theory has less evidence supporting it, but it reminds us that we don't know everything about the social dynamics of this period. There could have been tensions and conflicts we're not aware of. What we can say with confidence is that the burial was deliberate, organized, and thorough. This wasn't natural accumulation of soil over centuries. People moved large amounts of materials specifically to cover the structures. Archaeological evidence shows clear intentionality. And here's the really interesting part. The burial worked. For over 10,000 years, Göbekli Tepe remained hidden. It survived earthquakes, erosion, countless generations of people living in the region, and no one knew it was there. Until 1963, when researchers first noticed the site and misidentified it as a medieval cemetery. Even then, it took another 34 years before Klaus Schmidt recognized what it really was and began serious excavations. The people who buried Göbekli Tepe created an incredibly effective time capsule. Whether that was their intention or not, they preserved one of humanity's most important archaeological sites for future discovery. Thanks to their care and burial, we can still see the carvings clearly. The pillars, though covered for millennia, are in remarkably good condition. The structures retain their shape and layout. We can study the site and learn from it because those ancient people chose to protect it rather than destroy it or abandon it to the elements.
There's something poignant about this. People 10,000 years ago took the time and effort to carefully bury a place their ancestors had built. They could have just walked away. They could have taken the carved stones and reused them for something else, but they didn't. They preserved it. Maybe they hoped someone would find it again someday. Maybe they thought their descendants thousands of years in the future would uncover it and remember. Maybe they were trying to send a message across time. If so, the message was received. We found it. We're learning from it. We're marveling at what they built. And in doing so, we're connecting with people who lived 12,000 years ago, understanding them better, recognizing them as fully human, capable of extraordinary things. The burial of Göbekli Tepe might have marked the end of one chapter in human history, the transition from mobile hunter-gatherer societies to settled farming communities, but it also ensured that the achievements of that earlier era wouldn't be forgotten. The stones remain, speaking to us across the ages.
Here's something that should really blow your mind. After decades of excavation and research, archaeologists estimate they've uncovered only about 5% of Göbekli Tepe. Only 5%. That means 95% of the site is still buried, waiting to be discovered. Let me repeat that because it's so incredible. Everything we've talked about in this video, all the amazing pillars and carvings and enclosures, all the evidence that's rewritten our understanding of early human civilization, all of that represents just a tiny fraction of what's actually there. Ground-penetrating radar and geomagnetic surveys of the site have revealed at least 20 circular enclosures beneath the surface, possibly more. So far, only a handful have been excavated. What secrets are waiting in those unexcavated enclosures? What new carvings might we find? What new symbolism? What new architectural innovations? Every enclosure excavated so far has revealed unique features and carvings. Enclosure D, where the famous Vulture stone is located, is different from Enclosure C, which is different from Enclosure A. They share overall design principles, but each one has its own character, its own collection of symbols and animals. If that pattern holds for the unexcavated enclosures, and there's no reason to think it won't, then we have 15 or more unique structures still to discover, each with its own story to tell. Some of these structures might be even older than the ones already excavated. The site was used for 1,500 years, and building styles and symbolic systems likely evolved over that time. Earlier structures might show us the very beginnings of the traditions we see in the later enclosures. Or maybe some of the unexcavated structures are later, showing how the culture developed and changed before the site was finally buried. We might find evidence of new beliefs emerging, new artistic styles, new architectural experiments. There could be entirely new types of structures we haven't seen yet. So far, the excavated enclosures are circular or oval, but geomagnetic surveys hint that some of the buried structures might have different shapes. There are suggestions of rectangular buildings. What were those used for? How do they relate to the circular enclosures? Recent excavations have begun to uncover what appeared to be domestic structures, actual buildings where people might have lived, at least temporarily. This is surprising because earlier researchers thought Göbekli Tepe had no residential areas. If there are houses, even temporary or seasonal ones, that changes our understanding of how the site was used. Maybe some people did live there, at least during construction seasons or festival times. Maybe there was a small resident population of priests or caretakers who maintained the site between the larger gatherings. These domestic areas could tell us about daily life in ways the monumental enclosures can't. There could be workshops where stone tools were made, where pillars were carved, where the practical work of construction happened. Finding such areas would give us incredible insight into the techniques and organization of the building process. There might be storage areas, perhaps for food used during gatherings, or for ritual objects, or for tools and materials. Such discoveries could tell us about the logistics of maintaining such a large sacred site. And there could be burials. So far, remarkably few human remains have been found at Göbekli Tepe. This is unusual for such an important site. Were people buried there? If so, where? Finding burial areas could tell us about death practices, about who was important enough to be buried at this sacred place, about how these people treated their dead. The unexcavated portions of the site might also preserve better organic materials. The parts that have been exposed to air since excavation have started to deteriorate, but the areas still buried are protected. They might contain preserved plant remains, textiles, wooden objects, or other materials that rarely survive in archaeological contexts. Such finds could provide invaluable information about aspects of life that are usually invisible to archaeologists. So why hasn't more of the site been excavated? Why are researchers moving so slowly, taking decades to uncover just 5%? There are several reasons. First, proper archaeological excavation is painstaking work. Every centimeter of soil has to be carefully removed, sifted, and documented. Every object found has to be photographed, measured, cataloged. This takes time. Second, excavation is destructive. Once you dig up an area, you destroy the context it was in. Modern archaeologists are very careful to preserve as much information as possible before and during excavation, using photography, 3D scanning, detailed mapping, and other techniques. But still, excavation is permanent. You can't put things back the way they were. Third, preservation is a concern. Once ancient structures are exposed to air, sunlight, and weather, they start to deteriorate. The limestone at Göbekli Tepe is relatively soft and can be damaged by erosion. The carvings can wear away. To protect the excavated areas, the Turkish government and archaeologists have built a massive shelter over parts of the site, but this is expensive and complicated. There's a philosophy in modern archaeology that it's better to leave portions of important sites unexcavated. Future archaeologists will have better techniques, better technology, better preservation methods. By leaving areas untouched, we're ensuring that coming generations will be able to learn even more than we can learn now. Imagine if early excavators in the 1800s had completely dug up major sites. They didn't have radiocarbon dating, DNA analysis, isotope studies, or any of the sophisticated techniques we use today. Think of all the information they would have destroyed, information we can now extract from sites they left partially intact. The same logic applies to Göbekli Tepe.
Yes, we're learning incredible things from the 5% that's been excavated, but by leaving the other 95% for future researchers, we're ensuring that coming generations will be able to learn even more using techniques we haven't even invented yet. Still, ongoing excavations continue to make new discoveries. Just in recent years, researchers have found new carved pillars, new animal reliefs, new structural features. In 2023, a life-size statue of a wild boar was discovered, still showing traces of red, white, and black pigment. It's one of the most impressive three-dimensional sculptures found at the site. Every field season brings new surprises. Every newly excavated section reveals something we didn't expect. The researchers working there say that Göbekli Tepe has a way of constantly challenging their assumptions and forcing them to revise their theories. And remember, Göbekli Tepe isn't even the only site of its type. Archaeologists have discovered several other sites in the region with similar T-shaped pillars and megalithic architecture from the same time period. These include Karahan Tepe, Harbet Suvan Tepesi, Sefer Tepe, and others. These sites are collectively known as the Taş Tepeler, or Stone Hills. They suggest that Göbekli Tepe wasn't an isolated phenomenon. There was a whole culture in this region during the pre-pottery Neolithic period that built megalithic structures. Göbekli Tepe might be the largest and most impressive, but it was part of a broader cultural tradition. As these other sites are excavated and studied, we'll learn even more about this remarkable period in human history. Each site adds pieces to the puzzle, helping us understand what people believed, how they lived, what they valued. The next decades and centuries of research at Göbekli Tepe and related sites will undoubtedly bring discoveries we can't even imagine right now. Just as the initial excavations challenged everything we thought we knew about hunter-gatherers and the origins of civilization, future discoveries will probably challenge what we think we know now. That's the exciting thing about archaeology. There's always more to learn. The past isn't finished revealing its secrets. And somewhere beneath that Turkish hillside, covered by thousands of years of soil, are structures and artifacts that might completely change our understanding of human history once again.
So, let's bring this all together and talk about what Göbekli Tepe really means for our understanding of who we are and where we came from. For most of modern history, we've told ourselves a story about human progress. It goes something like this. Our ancestors were primitive. They lived in caves, grunting and struggling to survive. Slowly, painfully, over thousands of years, they got smarter. They invented farming. They built villages. They created cities. They developed writing and mathematics and science. And eventually, after a long climb from savagery to civilization, we arrived at the modern world. It's a comforting story in some ways. It makes us feel like we're at the pinnacle of human achievement. It suggests that progress is inevitable, that we're always getting better, smarter, more advanced. But Göbekli Tepe tells us a different story. It tells us that 12,000 years ago, people who lived by hunting and gathering, people who had no cities or writing or metal tools, were capable of extraordinary feats. They understood geometry and astronomy. They were skilled artists and engineers. They could organize themselves to accomplish massive projects. They had complex symbolic and spiritual lives. They created beauty that still moves us today. These weren't primitive ancestors struggling towards civilization. These were fully human beings with the same cognitive abilities we have, expressing themselves in ways appropriate to their time and place. The linear story of progress from simple to complex doesn't hold up. Human history is messier, more interesting, more surprising than that. Sophistication and complexity can appear in unexpected places and times. Great achievements can be made with simple tools. Profound ideas can be expressed without writing. Göbekli Tepe also tells us that what motivates humans isn't just survival. Yes, we need food and shelter and safety, but we also need meaning. We need beauty. We need connection to something larger than ourselves. We need to create, to express, to leave our mark on the world. The people who built Göbekli Tepe could have spent their time and energy just on getting food. They could have lived comfortable lives as successful hunter-gatherers without ever quarrying a single stone or carving a single pillar. But they chose to do something more. They chose to build a sacred place, to create art, to come together in community, to reach toward the divine or the transcendent. That choice, that human impulse to create meaning and beauty even at great cost, is what makes us human. It's been part of who we are for at least 12,000 years, probably much longer, and it's still part of who we are today. When you visit an art museum, or build a cathedral, or create a memorial for someone you loved, or even just stop to watch a sunset, you're expressing that same impulse that drove the builders of Göbekli Tepe. The tools and the context are different, but the fundamental human drive is the same. Göbekli Tepe also challenges us to be humble about what we think we know. If archaeologists could be so wrong about the capabilities of hunter-gatherers, what else might we be wrong about? What other assumptions about the past are waiting to be overturned by new discoveries? The truth is, we know far less about ancient history than we sometimes pretend. The archaeological record is incomplete. Vast periods of time have left barely any traces. Entire civilizations could have risen and fallen without leaving evidence we've found yet. This doesn't mean we should believe wild theories about ancient aliens or lost Atlantis, but it does mean we should hold our theories lightly, always be open to new evidence, and resist the temptation to think we have everything figured out. Göbekli Tepe reminds us that humans have always been capable of surprising things. Our ancestors weren't bumbling primitives. They were people like us, facing the challenges of their time with intelligence, creativity, cooperation, and courage. And if they could build Göbekli Tepe with stone tools and human muscle power, what does that say about human potential in general? If motivation and organization and shared purpose could move 50-ton stones 12,000 years ago, what could we accomplish today with all our technology if we were equally motivated and unified? That's perhaps the most inspiring message of Göbekli Tepe. It shows us that humans, working together toward a shared goal, can accomplish things that seem impossible. The limitations aren't in our tools or our technology. The limitations are in our imagination, our willingness to cooperate, and our commitment to something larger than ourselves. The stones of Göbekli Tepe have stood for 12,000 years, preserved by the care of the people who buried them and rediscovered by the curiosity of modern archaeologists. They connect us to our deep past, reminding us that we're part of a story that stretches back tens of thousands of years. And that story isn't finished. We're still writing it. We're still facing the same fundamental questions that concerned the builders of Göbekli Tepe. What is our place in the cosmos? How should we live together? What legacy will we leave for future generations? Göbekli Tepe doesn't give us the answers to these questions, but it shows us that humans have been grappling with them for a very, very long time. And it reminds us that the search for meaning, for beauty, for connection to something transcendent is central to what makes us human. So, the next time someone tells you that ancient people were primitive or unsophisticated, remember Göbekli Tepe. Remember that 12,000 years ago, hunter-gatherers built a temple on a hilltop, carved intricate art into massive stones, and left us a message that we're still trying to fully understand. They were us, we are them. Separated by thousands of years, but connected by our shared humanity. And somewhere under that Turkish hillside, there are still secrets waiting to be discovered, still stories waiting to be told, still evidence of human brilliance and ingenuity that will continue to amaze us for generations to come. Thank you so much for watching this deep dive into Göbekli Tepe. This is one of the most fascinating archaeological discoveries ever made, and I hope I've done it justice. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like. It really helps the channel grow and lets me know you want more content like this. Drop a comment below and let me know, what aspect of Göbekli Tepe fascinates you most? What other ancient mysteries would you like me to cover? I read every comment and I love hearing from you.
And definitely subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss future videos. I cover all kinds of fascinating topics in history, archaeology, and ancient civilizations. There's so much more to explore together. Until next time, keep looking at the past with wonder, keep questioning what you think you know, and keep marveling at the incredible things humans are capable of. Thanks for watching.